Hey everybody, this is the video for chapter 3 of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. This chapter is all about Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, for those of you reading Up with Slavery, you know quite a bit about him. For those of you, the majority of you who aren't reading about him, he was a former slave. He was born into slavery and at a young age was emancipated and lived in abject poverty. By his own sheer will, essentially, got himself an education and started a school in Alabama called the Tuskegee Institute. This chapter by Du Bois is basically an outline of who Booker T was, his philosophy, camps of African Americans who were both for and against what he stood for, and then a step-by-step criticism of what Du Bois calls the Atlanta Compromise. So we'll start with the Atlanta Compromise. The Atlanta Compromise was an unofficial deal that Booker T. Washington struck with Southern leaders. Booker T was concerned that Black people were not being educated and that they weren't able to get a hold of financial and economic certainty. They were still destitute. Yes, they were free, and we talked about all this. They were free, but they didn't have the means in order to actually start taking care of themselves, owning property and becoming citizens. So what Booker T, the deal he struck was that white society would agree to have free education for all Black people, and that education would be centered on, your basic education, but mostly based on industrial training, right? Think of, your 2-year community college things, right? Industrial, farming, things like that. And that white people would also recognize Black people's rights in court to due process, so that they were being treated fairly if a lawsuit was brought against them or if they brought a lawsuit against someone else. In exchange, what Booker T promised was that Black people would not seek any political power. They would let the white people have all political power. In fact, they wouldn't even vote. He also promised that, casual light racism and segregation would be tolerated by Black people, that it would be okay to keep Black people out of certain parts of town or keep them away from certain industries and things like that. And that there would be no protest on the African Americans' part in exchange for these things. So that's what Du Bois lays out in the beginning, is just kind of explaining who Booker T was and his, what he stood for. Then he goes and he gives basically a rundown of the history of Black leaders throughout, from about 1700 through the current time. And he starts by saying, there are 3 stages to the evolution of Black leaders at this time. Before about the early 1800s or so, Black leaders were chosen and championed mostly for their all-out hatred of white people, right? Back in the first chapter, that idea of liberty. We just need liberty. We need to oppose white slavery. We need to oppose the slaveholders, and we need to just be free. It's all we need. By the early 1800s, that idea started to morph, mostly because they weren't getting traction and just being rebellious to their slave owners. So it became more of a, we need to, what does he say? An attempt to adjust all thought and action to the will of the greater groups, on page 28. So it wasn't just oppose everything white, it was, well, what can we do as a group to make our lives better? Right? It doesn't seem like slavery is going to end. Nobody seems to be with us, and revolts have not been working. So, what do we need to do to make our lives better? Right? So, that's when, a lot of black leaders were secretly being educated by, white people around them, or there were a couple, for whatever means, educated blacks who were educating each other, and they were keeping it secret because that was against the law. After the Emancipation Proclamation is when Du Bois says the third type of leader started to emerge. And this is right in the area where Booker T started to emerge as the voice of the African American people. And it's that they needed to be, what's the term he uses? Self-realization and self-development, right? So now they have freedom. But now, since they don't really have a thing they need to oppose, they need to look within themselves in order to advance, right? And that's where Booker T was. Booker T came to influence at a time when there was a lot of, some African Americans were able to scrape together the money to get their education, or were, fortunate enough to be trained enough to do like some simple mill work or to run a small farm. But mostly, and he says in his book, when he first moved to Alabama to open the Tuskegee Institute, he'd go around and there were African Americans living on, farmland, and it was mostly fallow. They weren't using it at all. Or they were simply planting cotton in order to make money, and then they'd go and purchase their goods. There was no, rotation of crops. There was no, hey, we should, plant food so we can feed ourselves and things like that. So that's where Booker T came out. He realized that, what, we are never going to become an equal people if we don't start from the bottom, if we don't learn basic skills, and if all of us don't learn basic skills in order to be self-sufficient. At a later time, I'm assuming, he assumed that the political process would then start to take hold once they gained, at least a modicum of economic equality with white America. Then they could go back into the political realm. Du Bois, in his early years, so before the publication of this book, was all for Booker T and what he stood for. As Du Bois developed his own philosophy, he began to deviate rather heavily from what Booker T. Washington said, what he thought, and the Atlanta Compromise itself. So what Du Bois lays out in the rest of this chapter is that there are the three main points that Booker T establishes is that that they need to give up political power, insistence on civil rights, and higher education of Negro youth. So not becoming, getting a liberal arts degree, right? Let's not worry about English. Let's not worry about history. Let's, math, science, industry, farming, agriculture, right? What Du Bois says is that is short-sighted. That it is not enough to just get an economic foothold and even be guaranteed, quote unquote, legal protection. So he lays out all these reasons towards the end of the chapter as to why that's not feasible. And he goes kind of step by step throughout. And essentially it comes down to he, like in the first chapter, says, we can't focus on one thing. We have to fight for everything. We don't all have to fight for the same thing. We are a huge, diverse community, African Americans are, but we need to push for all of these things because what's good for one is not good for everyone. So making a compromise like we're going to give up political power doesn't serve all African Americans at the time, even though it at the time did seem like a really good idea. Yeah, let's get on our feet. Let's get, let's get some economic stability. Let's own some land. Let's, build ourselves up, accumulate some wealth, and then we can go from there. What Du Bois is saying is that's not working. And there needs to be a push for everything: civil rights, legal protection under the law, equal protection under the law, and economic training and higher education. Um, and essentially, what it comes down to is you have two men, two really great, important men in the history of African American philosophy and development in the early 20th century. You have these two men who come from very different places. And that is what drives both of their philosophies. Booker T grew up in slavery, came from abject poverty, right? The first quarter of Up From Slavery is mostly about like how he just struggled to get an education. And even after he got an education, the struggles he had when he went back to West Virginia, the struggles he had opening his school in Tuskegee in the beginning, despite having, the blessing and even some financial backing of white Northerners. So here you have a man who lived the reality of slavery, lived the reality of abject poverty, and he's saying, if my family had had basic income and I had been trained in, agriculture or industry or whatever at a young age, I would be in a better spot. And I think that would serve everyone, which is true. I mean, for him, it was true, right? He didn't go to school until he was 16. And then he had to work. He worked as a janitor, so he'd get up in the morning. He'd get everything ready. He'd said he'd wake up at like 4 in the morning. Classes started at 9. He'd get up, he'd clean, he would get fires in all the different rooms ready. He'd go to class all day, and then his entire evening was cleaning the school. He was the janitor, and that just paid for his board. He still had to figure out a way to pay the tuition. Right? And he was in deep fear that he would not get readmitted his second year because he owed on his tuition and he could not, for the life of him, get the money to pay the tuition back. But luckily, he was charismatic and he was a hard worker, and he set himself apart from his peers by being so determined that the school, they gave him his job back. They also gave him extra duties so that he could earn the money to be paying for his tuition on top of having his room and board paid for. So that's where he comes from. Then you have Du Bois, who's northern born, who is not born in slavery, right? Both of his parents are academics. They were both educated. Didn't have the same struggles as Booker T. Washington. And he sees it from if I had been trained that way, if I had been brought up that way, I wouldn't be where I am. And there are a lot of people like me who are the same. There are educated blacks. There are, somewhat wealthy blacks. There are, at the time, it's not the entire black population is living in poverty and is uneducated. So what he is saying is that we can't go with a one focus technique. We have to be striving for everything. And you focus on what is best for you. That is what you fight for. And the people who don't need that, they are going to focus on something else. And that's what they're going to fight for. And eventually, with everybody fighting for what they need, eventually we will have everything and there will be equality. And this was later reflected in Martin Luther King's philosophies and preaching, that it's not enough to just focus on one thing. We have to be striving for all, but civil rights is the most important thing. But we need all these assurances as well. If you ever, later when we read King, and if you ever read, the famous I Have a Dream speech, he talks about, the check that the U.S. government promised that has never been delivered, and that check is, it's both. He's talking about economic, that retributions were never paid, but he's also talking metaphorically that a check is a promise. And it is, if you go to the bank and you cash a check and they say, sorry, it bounced, well, that really doesn't do the person who wrote the check any bad. Yeah, you get a little, fee. But the person who was depending on what was in that check now doesn't have it and really doesn't have any recourse to get it. So that is what King says there. He's echoing Du Bois. And it all comes from this chapter. So it's a great chapter to read. Hopefully the background I just gave you gives you a leg up when you're reading it so you understand it. Don't get too bogged down by names. There's a lot of names they throw out. You can research them if you want to, but most of it you don't have to. Pages, I think it's about 22 to about 32. It's that history of African American leaders. A lot of that you can kind of scan just to get the idea of what it is he was talking about, but you don't need to know the names. And even after that, he starts talking about camps of people. There was a camp of people who were definitely opposed to Washington, and one that wasn't necessarily for him, but they didn't see a better alternative because there were no other leaders at the time. And Du Bois is establishing himself as a black leader at the time by going point by point over Booker T's Atlanta Compromise and kind of breaking holes in it. But ultimately, both of these men are necessary, to get to the point we are today. Both philosophies work for the kind of men they were, the people they were, right? Their background informs their philosophy, and neither is wrong. One is just more narrow than the other. But you can understand Booker T's point of view, and it made sense, and it was working for the people who, got the education, got the training, were protected in the courts. But there was a population of Black America who that wasn't working for. They already had those things, or they weren't interested in those things. And that's who Du Bois was fighting for. All right? So tomorrow, be sure you bring, or Monday in class, make sure you bring questions or comments or things you want to discuss about the chapter. We'll talk about it, and we'll have chapter 4 for Tuesday, Wednesday. Talk to you guys later. Bye.